Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Atomic Blonde from 2017. Now, Atomic Blonde is actually, I thought, an earlier movie than the release date that it has. Man, the last few years felt like a long time. Anyway, Atomic Blonde came out in 2017, a bit after the movie I'm inevitably going to have to compare it to, which is John Wick. I didn't know much about the movie, and we've talked a little bit previously about the spy genre and its ups and downs, and how the mid 2000s really had a whole series of just really bad modern takes on the spy and noir genres. And so I was going into this really hopeful that it would be an action movie with uh, competent spy elements and a turn away from a lot of the movie development elements that I think are typical of both the action and spy genres in modern times. I think most people are pretty aware at this point of John Wick as sort of a heralded as a new sort of action. Um, I hesitate to say king, but an action movie that is not afraid to be up close and personal and have good choreography and competent, physical acting to go with the, big names that tend to be attached to action movies these days. Um, Atomic Blonde has the lead actress is Charlize Theron, who I tend to think is a relatively underrated performer. She's been in a lot of pretty questionable to poor quality stuff, but I don't think that's any fault of her own. A few, I guess it might have been close to when it came out, since it was on Netflix. She was in 2020. She was in a film called The Old Guard, which was it was a superhero film, but not really. And it was not very good, but she did her absolute best in it. I've seen her in a lot of other things too, and I think she's a competent performer, and I'm always hopeful that she'll get better roles to star in. So I was pretty hopeful with this one. Um, it She co-stars with a whole bunch of other notable but not like enormously big names. James McAvoy is a major character. John Goodman has a minor a minor role. There's a lot of sort of smaller either character actors like Toby Jones, who's just incredible in everything, underrated in everything, underrated as an actor in general. Really like great actor. But plays largely small roles. And then a couple of other minor actors who are not like no background but have fairly limited roles. It was nice to also see Sophia Bouletta, or how am I'm botching that? Butella, or maybe it's Butea, I don't know. In a supporting role that wasn't terrible. We were trying to figure out what she had been in before, and realized that she was the mummy princess or whatever in the Mummy remake that was terrible. Um, but she's very good in this role, in the role that she has here, as is everyone else I mentioned and everybody else I didn't mention. I think across the board, the performances are really, really strong. And the castings are strong as well. In addition to just being solid castings for the roles that are um, on show, with this being the setting of Berlin in the 80s, in the late 80s. Um, Filling in these roles, I think the casting is really good. It's also nice to see I hesitate to use the word diversity because obviously that has taken a certain connotation in modern times, but the um, a variety of different character archetypes. You're not working. This is not a Jack Reacher situation where you're working solely with a bunch of gruff white guys. And obviously, with Charlize Theron being a female lead, that is also still shockingly rare in general. So my expectation generally going into this was that it was going to edge a little more towards the sort of zone that John Wick was in, given the success there. I was really hopeful that it wouldn't be a clone of John Wick, but with a female lead. That would have been kind of weak, but you know, not necessarily terrible. Um, I have my ups and downs in general on what this film turned out to be. Um, it turns out it's based on a comic. I didn't realize that, or a graphic novel, which I may have to go and read at some point. It's called The Coldest City, apparently. Um, and I think the setting is a really interesting one. The Cold War in general is obviously ripe for a variety of different stories to be told, either fictional or semi-fictional or imagined from historical accounting, um, and especially with a slightly more modern view. Obviously, with something like James Bond, it's heavily misogynistic and mired in the sort of bro. Well, I don't want to say broy, but it's this aristocratic attitude that comes out of Britain in the 30s, and it's very masculine heavy and kind of ends up being a little bit one note and somewhat dull as a result. And so transitioning away from that and having a setting that is, you know, post World War II, into deep into the Cold War and to the point of being borderline modern. Um, you know, it has its own foibles to start telling a female spy story then, because you can very quickly dip into the, oh, it's just a character that uses her sex appeal to trick men or whatever, and the whole thing is just men being dumb and horny. Thankfully it doesn't go that way either. What is interesting, though, is that it seems to sort of mix a variety of different ideas in terms of both tone and style that it's going for. Um, the beginning of the film is nice and slow. It takes its time to establish who characters are. It definitely acknowledges that it's cast an attractive woman in this role and that she is supposed to be attractive in the context of the world that she's working in, but also that is not her primary talent, so to speak. She is not just working as a honeypot, to use the somewhat misogynistic language of the spy genre in general, but that she's not solely there for that. She's there first and foremost because she is a competent operator. And as a matter of fact, there's almost nothing in the film that explicitly acknowledges her being female. Nobody's like, there's no old man really making cracks about like, oh, are we really gonna like have this woman go and do this thing? Like, that's basically completely absent, which is easily another, at least if not pitfall, at least pothole that the movie could hit, and it avoids that as well. As I said, the beginning opens really rather slowly and establishing the sort of whole story. It's told basically ex post facto, but it really flips back and forth on where the narrative focus is, and doesn't give a lot of warning about it. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does chop up the story in a way that can be a little bit confusing to follow. That said, for the most part, I think it uses it to its advantage to establish things you don't know yet in order for the things that have already happened that it's going to flash back to be more impactful. It's really telling two major through lines simultaneously. This operation that they went through, and the lead up, or rather the follow up after the fact. So generally structurally, I think it's a little bit it can be a little bit questionable, but I think it's pretty solid overall. What does start to fall apart a little bit pretty quickly is in early on, I think it did a really, really nice job of using its visuals in a at least an interesting way. I'm not going to say that it is the best cinematography that I've seen by any means. I'm not going to say that it's like uniquely stylish. We're not talking about a Sin City situation or something like that. But there is something definitely to be said for a lot of wide shots and interesting establishing shots that, now that I know that it was a graphic novel, are even more reminiscent of that sort of graphic novel style, and I think work really, really well. There's also some really nice use of color and movement to both draw the eye, the eye for the sake of telling the story and trying to focus the viewer on the things that are most important to key in on initially, but also to key in on what the characters are focused on. There is a whole series of flash forwards, or there's a whole series of scenes that happen in one room in particular that they use some really nice use of black and white. It's not quite black and white photography, but the phrase I would use with my limited my limited art education was, it's some really nice chiaroscuro work to sort of emphasize who's in power, who's got the upper hand in a situation, and that really is complemented by good performances by the actors. What they're wearing, how their posture is, the light and darkness on them and off them. It's a really interesting sequence, and it's done really, really nicely. Whether or not that was deliberately to mimic something in the graphic novel, I don't know, but I really like it visually. Where it gets a little muddy visually is in the latter part of the film. Obviously, this being set in Berlin and being set during, well, it's both in West and East Berlin, but they're trying to establish that, this is a conflict between the remaining Soviet occupation and the remaining Western occupation and the conflict therein. And obviously, as we talked about during things like Chernobyl, it's almost universal that something showing something that is Soviet is inevitably desaturated and grimy and ugly. That said, I don't think it is. I don't think it's overdone. It's not like totally gray all the time. It's not totally gray and brown. There's definitely an established feeling that this is a place that's run down and people are sort of having to be scrappy and struggle to get by, and that the situation is tense, and there's always, there's threats from all different sorts of factions. And so overall, while the visuals during the Berlin trip are less impressive overall, and definitely more muddy, I don't think that's a problem per se. They're just not visually as impactful as a lot of the other stuff. There is one exception. There's one particular room in during the Berlin trip that is just bizarre. It doesn't make any sense from a why would this room exist in this state? Who would have made this room and appointed it as such? And I'm not going to spoil that, but I think it should be relatively obvious where you look at this room and go, this is just somebody wanted to dress this room up like it's the 80s. And they just wanted to have all this weird lighting for aesthetic purposes rather than any practical thing. It's hard to really blame them for that. It makes for an interesting visual, but it is a little like, are you sure about that one? It took me out of the setting just a little bit. Um, Overall, I think the plot struggles a little bit, if only because it can't quite come to grips with what the story is it wants to tell, whether this is trying to whether this is a debriefing and whether it is trying to understand that what's actually happened, or trying to understand who's lying to whom and those sorts of things. And it is relatively smart about how it does a lot of that. I'm gonna you know, not spoil anything from that realm. I will say that there are some twists and turns throughout the story that I think are largely pretty good. But my concern is that near the end, there are some revelations that I don't think add a whole lot to the story overall or to the depth of any one character. Um, and actually just end up confusing the narrative by the end. Is the result deeply negative? No, it rallies by the end and saves itself, but I don't think it is undamaging to the narrative. I think they could have ended um, more cleanly if they hadn't overcomplicated the ending. Um, it does make for some interesting, I think, regardless of that particular thing I'm referencing. I think overall it bears rewatching once you understand everything that's going on and who everyone is, or at least I probably will. Whether or not it will fall apart as a result is sort of my concern. I'm worried on a second watch you'll go, this doesn't make any sense, they're just lying to me in order for me to believe this so that they can have a twist later. It probably wouldn't be totally awful, but I am not sure whether they actually thought it all the way through on that, and whether on subsequent watches it gets better or it gets worse. I am curious about that. There is a pretty great soundtrack as well. They do use a lot of sort of pop music from the era, but I think it's really selectively done and well done. I think it lends itself to the more comic aspect of it, but both in the sense of like being like in the graphic novel style, and also being a little bit more self-aware and aware of its own slight absurdity. Um, it does get me into a whole sort of thing about whether the absurdity is well balanced throughout. I think there are portions of the film that take themselves a little too seriously and forget that the whole thing is a bit absurd, but it doesn't ultimately damage it really substantially. Uh, and you know, overall, I think it comes out to a pretty solid whole. I don't think it's quite as tight as something like John Wick, but it's hard to be. John Wick is very simple, extremely simple, and would be hard to make any cleaner or any tighter in its execution. I also think there's some much more impressive things in this film than John Wick. There's a couple of choreographed sequences that I think are actually really very good. There's a few that are not so great. But there's one in particular in the latter half of the film that is quite long and excellently executed. And there's some really nice, subtle things that they do to avoid cutting, or they either hide cuts or they don't cut. There's some pretty long takes, and I'm not sure how much of them are completely oneers, but they are very impressive. And I don't think they detract from, as I've talked about, oneers can detract from a movie overall. I think they hold up on their own, and I think they're also interesting as oneers. Um, Overall, I'm pretty happy with the film. It's got some issues here and there, but on the whole, I think I'm pretty pleased with it. I'm definitely going to have to watch it again. If you are looking for something that's a little bit smarter, a little bit different, and a little bit more interesting in the spy genre than anything, at least that I've seen in the last 10 years, I think I'd pretty highly recommend it. Yeah. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.